For decades, Gene Simmons has treated outrage like a marketing tool. He has bragged about money, bragged about women, and shrugged off scandal after scandal with the same line, "That's just Gene being Gene." But in the final months of 2025, three things collided at once: a car crash that could have killed him, the death of the man who helped him build Kiss in the first place, and a comment so loaded that even his own fans went quiet. This time, the noise around Gene Simmons doesn't feel like part of the act. It feels like something is actually catching up to him. To understand why this moment lands so differently, it helps to go back to where the persona started. Gene Simmons was born Heimwitz in Haifa, Israel, in the summer of 1949. His parents were Hungarian Jews who had survived the horrors of the Holocaust, and his mother had lived through Auschwitz as a teenager, losing much of her family in the process. That history wasn't a distant fact in the household. It shaped the atmosphere of his childhood, long before he ever picked up a bass guitar. When his parents' marriage broke apart, his mother raised him alone, and in 1957 she made the decision that would define the rest of his life. She sold what little they had and bought 2 tickets to New York. The boy who arrived in Queens barely spoke English. He was mocked in school for answering questions in Hebrew, and he had to teach himself the language and culture of his new country by devouring comic books, watching television reruns, and mimicking radio announcers. That drive to master a new identity from scratch never really left him. By his late teens, he was playing in scrappy, forgettable New York bar bands, learning not just how to play music, but how to read a crowd. What made people clap? What made a bar owner want to book you again? Somewhere in those years, Heimwitz became Gene Klein, and eventually Gene Simmons, a name built for a marquee. The turning point came when he met Stanley Eisen, who would become known as Paul Stanley. Together, after a false start with a band called Wicked Lester that got shelved by a record label, they stripped everything down and rebuilt themselves as Kiss in 1973. The idea wasn't just to be a band. It was to become larger-than-life characters, comic book figures come to life, with makeup, blood, fire, and spectacle standing in for subtlety. Gene's fire-breathing, blood-spitting demon persona became one of the most recognizable images in rock history, and by the mid-1970s, with albums like Destroyer and songs like Rock and Roll All Night, Kiss had gone from playing to a handful of people in Queens to filling arenas. What set Simmons apart from most of his peers wasn't just the theatrics, it was his approach to the business behind them. He treated Kiss less like a band and more like a licensing empire, putting the demon face on everything from lunchboxes to pinball machines to comic books. By some estimates, Kiss merchandise has generated well over $1 billion over the decades. Fans weren't just buying albums anymore, they were buying into a brand. And Simmons made sure he controlled as much of that brand as he possibly could, right down to trademarking hand gestures associated with the band. That business instinct is also where a lot of the criticism of Simmons has always come from. He has never pretended to be motivated by anything other than money, and has said as much in interview after interview over the years. That honesty has earned him respect from some fans who find it refreshing in an industry full of performers who pretend not to care about profit. It has also fed a narrative, pushed by his critics, that Simmons sees almost everything, nostalgia, controversy, even grief, as something that can ultimately be monetized. For years, that reputation played out mostly through smaller, recurring controversies. Simmons has long argued that hip-hop artists shouldn't be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, insisting rock should remain guitar-based, a position he doubled down on even after NWA's induction in 2016 sparked pushback from artists like Ice Cube. His made blunt, sometimes callous remarks about musicians who died from addiction or suicide, including comments about Prince's death in 2016 that many considered harsh and dismissive. Each time, the pattern was similar. Simmons said something provocative, faced backlash, and either doubled down or moved on to the next headline. It became a kind of ritual, something fans shrugged off with the phrase, "That's just Gene being Gene." But 2025 turned out to be a very different kind of year, one where the controversies started overlapping with real physical danger and real grief. In early October, Simmons was driving his SUV down the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu when he passed out behind the wheel. According to his wife, Shannon Tweed, he had recently been put on a new medication and warned by doctors to drink more water, something she says has never been good about. Whatever the exact cause, the result was frightening. His Lincoln Navigator drifted across several lanes of oncoming traffic before slamming into a parked truck. Video obtained afterward showed just how close. The accident came to being catastrophic. Witnesses and even his former bandmate Paul Stanley later said it was a miracle Simmons walked away largely unharmed, since a slightly different angle could have sent him over the bluff toward the ocean below. Simmons was hospitalized, evaluated, and released the same day. True to form, he tried to downplay it almost immediately, joking on social media that he'd simply had a small fender bender because he's a horrible driver. For a 76-year-old man who had just lost consciousness on a busy highway, the joke struck many people as an uncomfortable way to wave off something serious. That crash alone might have been the story of the year for Simmons. Instead, it became just the first chapter in a much heavier few months. On October 16th, Ace Frehley, the original Kiss lead guitarist known to fans as the Spaceman, and one of the 4 men who helped build the band's mythology in the first place, died at 74. Frehley had suffered a fall at his home studio in New Jersey in September, and an autopsy later determined the cause of death to be blunt force injuries to the head sustained in that fall. Frehley had spent much of his life open about his struggles with addiction, and had proudly discussed his decades of sobriety in interviews over the years. His death sent a wave of tributes through the rock world, from Slash to Tom Morello, and Simmons and Stanley issued a joint statement calling him an essential and irreplaceable part of the band's history. Simmons attended the funeral alongside Stanley and original drummer Peter Criss. For a while, it looked like Simmons might handle Frehley's death with the kind of restraint the moment called for. Then came an interview with the New York Post that changed the tone completely. Speaking about Frehley's final years, Simmons suggested that a pattern of poor choices, rather than the fall itself, was ultimately responsible for his old bandmate's death, pointedly noting that Frehley hadn't taken advice from people who cared about him, including himself. He implied there might have been deeper issues behind the fall that a simple accident wouldn't fully explain. Coming so soon after Frehley's death, and aimed at a man who had spent years publicly proud of overcoming his struggles, the comments landed badly. Fans and fellow musicians accused Simmons of blaming a friend for his own death at the worst possible moment, and the backlash built for days. Then, in the middle of that backlash, Simmons found himself at the center of an entirely different controversy, this one playing out not on social media, but on Capitol Hill. In December, Kiss was honored with a Kennedy Center honor, a major recognition of the band's cultural impact. Just 2 days later, Simmons appeared before a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee to testify in support of the American Music Fairness Act, a bill that would require terrestrial AM or FM radio stations to pay performance royalties to the artists whose songs they play, something radio has never had to do in the United States, even though streaming services already do. It's a genuine policy issue, and one plenty of serious musicians and industry figures have lobbied for over the years. Simmons made his case by pointing out that legends like Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra never received a cent for the endless radio airplay of songs like White Christmas, while everyone else in that chain, from the advertisers to the DJs, got paid. It's how he chose to frame that injustice that turned heads. Simmons told the subcommittee that when other countries learn how American radio treats its biggest stars, they'll see that those artists are treated worse than slaves, adding that at least slaves were given food and water while performers like Elvis and Sinatra got nothing at all for their work. The comparison drew immediate criticism. Commentators pointed out that comparing unpaid royalties, however unfair the system might be, to the brutality of slavery trivializes one of the darkest chapters in human history, and that the remark landed with extra weight given that the hearing itself took place in a city built in large part through forced labor. It wasn't the first time Simmons had reached for an extreme comparison to make an economic point, but this one arrived at a moment when he was already under fire for his comments about Frehley, and the two controversies started to blur together in the public conversation. By December 10th, with backlash mounting from multiple directions, Simmons posted an apology addressing his remarks about Frehley specifically. He wrote that on reflection he had used the wrong words, that he never intended to hurt Ace or his legacy, and that rereading his own comments had shown him how much they had hurt people. He insisted that he had always loved Frehley. It was a notably direct apology for a man who has spent most of his public life refusing to walk anything back. Whether that apology will be enough to change the broader narrative remains to be seen, especially since it came on the heels of a car accident that nearly ended far worse than it did, and a Senate testimony moment that many are still discussing for reasons Simmons probably didn't intend. What makes this stretch of Simmons' life different from his usual controversies isn't really the shock value of any single comment. It's the accumulation. A near-fatal car crash tied to his own health. The death of one of the men who helped create the character that made him famous. Comments about that death that reopened old wounds among fans and fellow musicians. And a public remark about slavery that overshadowed a genuinely important piece of legislation he was trying to champion. Any one of those events would have been a rough news cycle for most public figures. Taken together, they paint a picture of a 76-year-old man whose instinct to push forward, joke through pain, and speak first and think later is starting to collide with the realities of age, mortality, and a cultural moment that is far less forgiving of careless words than it used to be. Fans remain split, the way they've always been split on Gene Simmons. Some see an aging rock icon who built an empire out of honesty about his own ambition, who says uncomfortable things because he's never been interested in being liked. Others see a pattern of a man who leans on shock and spectacle even when the moment calls for something gentler. Grief, humility, restraint. What's different now is that the stakes feel higher than they used to. A joke about a car crash lands differently when the crash could have killed him. A comment about a bandmate's death lands differently when that bandmate is actually gone. And a throwaway comparison to slavery lands differently in a Senate hearing room than it might have on a late-night talk show decades ago. Gene Simmons built a career out of controlling his own image, down to trademarking the smallest details of the character he created. But the story unfolding now isn't one he can fully script. It's being shaped by a highway crash caught on video, a funeral with an open casket, a Senate hearing room, and a public apology posted in the middle of the night. Whether this becomes just another chapter in the long history of That's Just Gene being Gene, or the moment where the persona finally stops being able to absorb the weight of real consequences, is something even Simmons himself may not have an answer to yet.